Alright, I'm going to start by mentioning a few things I forgot to talk about in my Snap Heap video, which was the last video in the series. You can, in relation to phase plant, you can use the macros in phase plant or the other modulators to move around the macros in Snap Heap and Multipass. But to have a macro on the front page, you'll notice I only have one macro in the Snap Heap window right now, and that's because I only have one macro that's active. So if my macros aren't routed to anything, they're not going to appear on Faceplant's interface, in which case I can't use them, and that's that. Oh yeah, very fun. You can use Snap Heaps inside of Snap Heaps, and same rules apply as before. I guess this would be the equivalent of using patchers inside of patchers or Ableton racks inside of racks or whatever. Got your cool shit going on. I'm not an Ableton user, but I know Ableton's probably better in FL Studio or whatever because I hear about it all the time. Anyways, it's not about Ableton. This video is about Multipass, and I should have talked about those things in the last video, but in case you haven't noticed, I'm a fairly low intelligence kind of guy. It looks kind of intimidating, but thankfully the interface isn't all that different from Snap Heap or Faceplant. It's not a huge adjustment. It just looks really complicated because you have so many lanes. And the lanes function a little bit differently than Snap Heap. They accomplish slightly different things. But I'll start from the top, and we'll work our way to the bottom. So we got Multipass, cool plugin. You can click the folder and you can browse through presets by clicking the arrows, or you can go into the different folders in your preset browser. You can save the preset. You can reset to default by clicking the new button, undo it if you change your mind, redo. Your standard kilohertz has undo and redo buttons, and they're really nice. I like them. I will marry them. Fuck. We have the macros, 8 of them as usual, and these function the same as the macros in Faceplant and Snap Heap. So I'll go over it again though. If you mouse over a modulator in Multipass, you'll see an orange symbol, and if you click on the orange symbol, you'll see more of them, and you can route different knobs to the macros or the other modulators for that matter, and any knob that has an orange symbol can be modulated. Now, we have, I'm drawing a blank. I'll just move on to the LFOs. These modulators are all the same in Multipass as they are in Snap Heap. So if you watched that video, you probably know how these work kind of, but I'll go over them again. The LFOs are both the same. You have 2 of them. Phase control is the starting point in the waveform. See the waveform moving around when I change the phase. Just a little visual glitch, but it doesn't really change much besides where the waveform starts when you hit a note. Speed is this big number down here. It's in hertz by default, but you can sync it up to the host tempo. Then you have your orange symbol in the top left, and that's where you modulate things from. You have your shapes just below that, your sine, triangle, square, saw, standard, fair. Then you have your sine random and square random if you want a more messy kind of modulation. You can control the LFO depth if you only want a little bit of movement. Those are the main controls. Then we get over here, and this is the retrigger section. So retrigger is off by default. The LFO will keep running regardless of what you're doing with your MIDI. But if you turn retrigger on, then the LFO will reset every time you hit a new note. And if you have sample and hold activated, basically what happens is if you hit a note, the LFO will freeze at that point and it'll stay there as in hold until you hit a new note. And that's what sample and hold does in a nutshell. It's pretty useful. I mean, the image line plugins don't really have it, and I don't know why. It's so weird because, generally image line plugins are decent, but whatever, I digress. You have your source, which is basically what sound source are you using to activate the LFO if you have retrigger on. So we have the main, which is just your general, sound coming in. External would be sideband, I believe. If you know how sideband works, that's, I believe, what external is. And then you have your 5 bands. So how the 5 bands will retrigger your LFO is if you have, say, I'll just use 2 bands for this example. You have a lot of stuff happening above, you know, your 900 hertz, but below 900 hertz in this case, there is no sound. In which case, if you have band 1 on retrigger, even though you have sound coming in, band 1 is silent, completely silent, so it won't retrigger the LFO. But if I use band 2, it will. Now, if I have all 5 bands activated, you can choose between all 5 bands, and that's basically, each band in your frequency spectrum. Then you have the gate, which is basically how loud do you want the sound to be to activate the LFO. And it looks high, but it's really not. It's at minus 20 decibels. I guess if you're working with quieter sounds, it might be a problem. So if you're using retrigger, you don't want gate to be a problem, just turn it all the way down. Simple solution. Right. Second LFO is exactly the same as the first one, other than the fact it's called LFO2 and not Elephant 1. I like slurring my words, guys. It's like my special ability. Envelope followers. Very cool, very fun. I'm so fucking stupid. Your orange symbol is in the left-hand corner as usual, and to the right of them, you see your ADSR control. Now, you'll notice the decay and the sustain are grayed out, and that's because I'm not using the ADSR mode. Basically, what happens is Multipass will look for MIDI input to activate the envelope follower. So it's basically like an ADSR, hence the name, within Multipass. If you're using peak or RMS, you won't have that option to use decay and sustain, but attack and release still apply. So attack is the time coming in to the envelope, and release is the time going back to nothing on the envelope. Peak and RMS, these two modes are basically the same, but RMS uses like an averaged out volume instead of just what's happening at that very moment that the envelope follower is working. You have your source like in the LFO. Down below we have exponential and linear, and this is just a different tension basically on your curve. Linear is normal curvature. Legato it's a subtler feature, but if you're using like multiple notes or whatever, legato is on, it'll start the envelope follower from the current level, and this only really applies if you're using ADSR. If you're not using ADSR, it won't really affect the sound much. If legato is off, it'll restart the ADSR from scratch. And you'll notice that because I've got ADSR, the curve and the legato turn blue, and that's an indication that they're on. Blue means on in kilohertz plugins, I guess. I don't want to forget to mention that because that's kind of important. Gate's still here, as usual. Gate's not going anywhere. Then second elephant. Fuck, I'm still talking about LFOs. Second envelope follower is the same. Now we have the pitch follower, and basically what the pitch follower does is it tries to track the note that's coming in from the audio signal. And this is our visual feedback section. It's a bit different from the other ones, but basically it's your 88 keys, and you have your range represented by these two lines down vertically. Fuck. And then you can control the range by moving these two lines around, and it'll tell you what note the range will end at. Sources here again, you have your sideband. Root, by default, it's at A4, which is like neutral. No change in root tracking, no change in pitch tracking. If you move root left or right, you'll get negative or positive modulation, and sensitivity more or less just makes the pitch follower track the pitch more closely, and you can get some kind of artifacty type shit going on, but other than that, it's just like sharper, I guess, more accurate. Sometimes when sensitivity is too low, you don't even get any modulation at all, which is interesting. There's that gate again. Fuck that gate. Then we have our pitch wheel and mod wheel, and this MIDI section basically only applies if you have a MIDI keyboard, but I guess you can move these around without them. It's just kind of inconvenient. If you have a MIDI keyboard, you can link up your pitch and your mod wheels to the MIDI keyboard, and then you can move them around, or you could just automate them inside your DAW, I guess. Pitch is bipolar, which means that you can go above and below the center point, and mod is just unipolar, which means it only goes up from the center point. Pitch will snap back to 0 every time you use it. That's something to note. And mod does not, so also something to keep in mind. Now these three controls are only applied if you're using a MIDI keyboard. Note, you might at first think it's like the same as this pitch tracking, but it's actually, if you are playing notes on your MIDI keyboard, it'll take that MIDI information and modulate whatever notes you're playing. I don't have a MIDI keyboard plugged in right now, so I can't really demonstrate it. But if you link up your MIDI controller to the note tracking, you can do that. Modulate your values, your knobs, according to what notes you're playing. Velocity is similar. It's according to how loud your notes are, though. It's regardless of note, but it applies to the velocity or the volume, like how hard you hit the note. Pressure is a less common feature. It's about aftertouch. So if your keyboard has aftertouch, it's basically, this pressure is linked to how the value of your aftertouch. So that's after you release the note on your keyboard. That's basically what aftertouch is. And that's basically the modulator section. This doesn't really do anything, but you can actually modulate the speed, which is how fast your snake moves. Epic. Yeah. Alright, now we get into the meat of things, which are the effects lanes. So if you saw the Snap Heap video, or if you've used Snap Heap, it's like 4 lanes, one going into the next. You can do some parallel stuff with the lanes, but that's basically how Snap Heap works. It's 4 of these lanes. Now, Multipass has 2 normal lanes, a pre-effects, which is your effects before your effects, your lane split, and then your post effects, which is processing after your frequency split. Now, this huge section in the middle, this is where most of the action happens in Multipass. You have a maximum of 5 lanes, and you can control basically the frequency domain of each lane. So for example, this bottom lane, it's always the bottom most frequencies, but what you can do is you can just have 1 lane. That's one thing you can do. And then this frequency section is 183 hertz to 802 hertz. So basically, I've got my frequency spectrum split up into 5 different parts, and each lane processes a different part. So what a lot of people will do with this kind of processing is they will completely mono out the low signal and maybe put some stereo effects on the higher frequencies. That's just one example of what you can do with Multipass, but there's really an unlimited amount of stuff you can do. Now that you can have Multipass inside Multipasses, it's like there's so much that is probably never even going to be touched on that you can do in Multipass. Basically unlimited kind of, the possibilities are endless kind of synth, but I mean, that's what it is. Now these blue lights will turn on or off the effects in a signal. It won't mute the sound, it'll just stop the effects from doing anything. These 2 lights, mute and solo, will, if you want to focus on one frequency spectrum, you can solo your frequency, your effects lane, So for example, right now I'm soloing my low frequencies, but if you don't want to hear that frequency spectrum or that area in the frequency spectrum, you can mute it and then you can focus on the other ones. You don't have to have all 5 going at once. Like I said, you can just have 2. I find myself using 2 the most often because 5, it's nice that they have 5, but that's a lot of control. That's like a ton of control. And I've never needed 5 lanes. Usually I'm just using 1 or 2 lanes, and it's kind of funny because multipass is for multiple lanes. Like 3, I'll use sometimes, 2 most of the time, but sometimes I'll just have 1 lane. I'm like, why did I do that? But it's nice if you're using multipass just to have a little bit of fun. Maybe give your sound that extra like 1% that it could use. I don't know. That's up to you how you process your sounds. Like I said, if all your lanes are disabled, then you're not going to be able to do anything in here, but you can still add snap-ins or whatever. All the controls in Kilohearts plugins, faceplant, snap heap, etc. still apply. So you can copy, paste modules. You can hold Alt and then you can put a module before another module. I guess it's just it's a less roundabout way of moving your modules around. I forgot to say you can hold down Control and that's how you copy. I just said you can copy stuff. I'm like, oops. Shift, fine tune. I'm pretty sure I went over these already. I have like dementia or something. Shift, slower movement of the knobs, right click, exact values, and down here. We're all the way at the bottom now, so we're at the mix, lane mixing controls. So pretty much the same thing as before. Gain is the volume going out of the lanes. Pan is the panning going out of the lanes, so that's like where it is in the stereo field, like left speaker, right speaker. Mix is the amount applied by the effects to the sound. Gain, out, pan, mix are still here. The influence that the post lane effects will have on the output of this lane. So that's like these effects in the post effects lane affecting the lanes in the middle. And then the post effects is the same as the pre effects. It's just after your frequency split occurs and you've done all that processing or whatever. And one last thing, you can resize your multipass window by dragging on the corner. I should have mentioned that before, but that's something I do fairly often when I want to squeeze more stuff into my screen. Anyway, I definitely fucked something up because I'm actually done and I didn't have to restart the recording, but we'll see what happens. I don't know, fuck.